Sometimes the hardest choices aren't made with guns, but with conscience. In winter, 1887, rancher Abel Givens, 61, watched a fireball tear across Montana's sky and crash into the woods near his homestead. What his dog dragged back wasn't from any earthly forge. Within days, quiet Larkspur exploded with treasure hunters and drifters driven by greed. But the strange metal brought more than chaos. Crops grew overnight, bullets flattened harmlessly, and the dying found health. As wonder and lawlessness collided, the town looked to Abel, the only steady hand. He faced an impossible choice: protect a miracle that could save lives or bury it before it destroyed them all. What would you do if heaven fell into your backyard? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana winter of 1887 came down hard and stayed that way. Snow blanketed the valley floor 3 feet deep in places, and the wind off the Rockies had teeth that bit through wool and leather alike. Abel Givens stood in the doorway of his barn, watching the last light fade from the western sky, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. At 61, he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned long ago not to waste motion in country that didn't forgive carelessness. His homestead sat at the northern edge of Larkspur, a town of maybe 300 souls on a good Sunday. The ranch itself wasn't much to speak of: a sturdy cabin built from lodgepole pine, a barn that had weathered 15 winters, a chicken coop, and corrals that held a dozen head of cattle and 3 horses. It was honest ground, paid for with honest work, and that suited Abel just fine. He had seen enough of the world during his younger years: the cattle drives up from Texas, the mining camps in California, the brief and brutal time he had worn a deputy's badge in Kansas. Those days felt like someone else's memories now, faded photographs in the album of his mind. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver watch, its case worn smooth by 3 decades of handling. The inscription inside read, "To Abel with all my heart, Margaret." His wife had given it to him on their wedding day in 1856, back when the world seemed full of nothing but promise. Margaret had been gone for 7 years now, taken by pneumonia one bitter February when the doctor couldn't make it through the snow in time. Some men remarried. Abel had thought about it once or twice, mainly during the long winter evenings when the silence in the cabin pressed down like a physical weight. But he always came back to the same conclusion. He had loved once, loved deeply, and that would have to be enough for one lifetime. A low woof came from beside him, and Abel looked down at Scout, his blue heeler mix. The dog was 10 years old, graying around the muzzle, but still sharp-eyed and attentive. Scout had been a gift from Margaret the year before she died, a pup she had insisted they needed, even though Abel had protested they were getting too old to train a new dog. As always, Margaret had been right. Scout had become his constant companion, a living connection to the woman who had known him better than he knew himself. "Time to finish up and head inside," Abel said, more to hear his own voice than because Scout needed the instruction. The dog understood routines better than most people understood conversation. Abel made his final rounds with practiced efficiency. The cattle had hay and shelter in the near pasture. The horses were settled in their stalls, their feed bins full. The chickens were locked up tight against foxes and coyotes. Everything was as it should be, the same as it had been every night for more years than he cared to count. There was comfort in that predictability, a steadiness that anchored him against the changes he had seen sweep through Montana territory. Over the past 2 decades, Larkspur itself had grown from a handful of tents and a trading post to a proper town with a main street, a church, a school, and even a small newspaper that came out on Fridays. The railroad had reached them 5 years back, and with it came people who saw Montana as opportunity rather than ordeal. Some of them stayed. Most moved on when they realized that opportunity and hard work were the same thing out here, just spelled different. Abel knew most everyone in Larkspur by name and a good deal about their business besides. There was Doc Pritchard, a former army surgeon who had settled in town after the war between the states. A man who could set a broken bone or deliver a baby with equal competence, but who drank too much on Saturday nights and regretted it every Sunday morning. There was Samuel Chen, who ran the general store with his wife Lynn and their 3 children. People who had come west from San Francisco and found in Larkspur the kind of acceptance they had never known in the city. There was Father Michaels at the Catholic Church, a young priest from Boston who still hadn't quite figured out that Western piety looked different than Eastern piety, but who was learning. And there was Cora Mackenzie, the school teacher, a widow of 45 who had moved to Larkspur 3 years ago after her husband died in a mining accident down in Butte. She was a handsome woman, with grey threading through her dark hair and a directness in her manner that some folks found unsettling but that Abel appreciated. They had become friends of a sort, sharing coffee on Sunday afternoons after church, talking about books and weather and the small happenings of town life. Nothing romantic, though Abel suspected Cora might not have objected if he had been inclined that way. But the watch in his pocket was a constant reminder that some doors, once closed, stayed closed. The town also had its share of harder characters. Jake Marston ran the Silver Spur Saloon and wasn't particular about who he served or what got said within his walls, as long as money crossed his bar. The current sheriff, a man named Tom Hutchins, was competent enough but lacked the spine needed when trouble turned serious. He was the kind of lawman who was fine for settling disputes about property lines or hauling drunks to the jail to sleep it off. But Abel had his doubts about how Hutchins would handle anything that required real authority. Then there were the drifters and seasonal hands who came and went with the work. Cowboys looking for ranch employment, prospectors heading into the mountains with dreams of striking gold or silver, gamblers working the circuit of western towns. Men whose names you learned one week and forgot the next because they never stayed long enough to matter. Abel didn't judge them. He had been that kind of man himself once, moving from place to place before Margaret had convinced him to put down roots. As Abel latched the barn door, Scout suddenly went still, his ears pricked forward. The dog was staring at the northern sky, a low growl building in his throat. Abel followed the dog's gaze and felt his breath catch. A light was moving across the heavens, brighter than any star, brighter even than the full moon that hung over the eastern peaks. It moved with unnatural speed, a streak of blue-white fire that seemed to tear the very fabric of the night. For a moment, Abel could only stare. In all his years, through all his travels, he had never seen anything like it. The light grew brighter, closer, and he could hear it now. A sound like distant thunder mixed with something else, something that made his teeth ache and his scalp prickle. The fireball passed directly overhead, close enough that he could feel warmth on his upturned face despite the bitter cold. And then it was gone, disappearing beyond the western ridge with a flash that lit the snow-covered landscape bright as noon. The sound of impact followed seconds later. A deep, concussive boom that rattled the barn door and sent the horses whinnying in alarm. Scout barked once, sharp and urgent, then looked up at Abel as if seeking an explanation for what they had just witnessed. Abel stood very still, his heart hammering in his chest. He was not a superstitious man. He had little patience for fortune-tellers or spirit mediums or any of the other nonsense that sometimes made its way through town. But what he had just seen defied any rational explanation he could muster. It had not been a shooting star. Those were common enough on clear winter nights. This had been something else entirely, something substantial and purposeful in the way it moved. He reached down and rested his hand on Scout's head, feeling the tension in the dog's muscles. "Easy now," he said quietly. "Whatever that was, it's done with now." But even as he spoke the words, Abel knew they weren't true. Whatever had just fallen from the sky into the woods beyond the western ridge, it was not done. It had only just begun. He could feel it in his bones, that same instinct that had kept him alive in his younger days, when survival often depended on reading situations before they fully developed. He stood there in the cold for another long moment. watching the sky for any sign of another fireball. But the heavens had returned to their usual scattered glory of stars and moon. The world around him was silent, except for the wind and the settling sounds of livestock disturbed by the boom. Yet something had changed. He could not have put words to it, but he felt it nonetheless, a shift in the air, a sense that the careful order of his life had just been disrupted in ways he could not yet comprehend. Finally, he turned toward the cabin, Scout close at his heels. He would tend the fire, make his supper, and think on what he had seen. In the morning, perhaps, things would make more sense. Perhaps Doc Pritchard, or some of the other men in town, had seen it too, and they could puzzle it out together over coffee and common sense. But as Abel settled into his chair by the fire that evening, the silver watch resting on the table beside him, he found himself returning again and again to that moment of impossible light. Margaret had always said he was a practical man, maybe too practical for his own good. "There's more to the world than what you can see or touch," she used to tell him, usually when he scoffed at some tale of wonder or mystery. Just because you don't understand something doesn't mean it isn't real. He had never quite believed her about such things. But tonight, watching the flames dance in the fireplace while Scout dozed at his feet, Abel found himself wondering if perhaps his late wife had known something he did not. The world, it seemed, had just reminded him that despite 61 years of living, there were still things beyond his understanding. Outside, the Montana winter continued its cold grip on the land. Inside, Abel sat with his thoughts and his memories, unaware that the life he had so carefully built was about to be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The silver watch ticked steadily on the table, counting down moments toward a future that would demand every ounce of wisdom and courage he possessed. And in the woods beyond the western ridge, something waited in the snow. Morning came with that peculiar brightness that only fresh snow and clear sky can produce. Abel woke before dawn, as always, the habit of a lifetime too ingrained to break. He dressed in layers against the cold, started the fire from banked coals, and put coffee on to boil. Scout stretched and yawned, then padded to the door with the expectant look of a dog ready for his morning routine. Abel let him out and stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the eastern peaks. The air was still, cold enough to make his lungs ache, and the world lay pristine and white in all directions. It was the kind of morning that made a man glad to be alive, despite the hard work and harder years. He thought briefly about the fireball from the night before, but in the stark clarity of morning light, it seemed less ominous. A meteor, perhaps, or some other natural phenomenon he simply had not encountered before. The world was full of such things. He was pouring his second cup of coffee when Scout came back, and the moment Abel saw the dog, he knew something was wrong. Scout was carrying something in his mouth, but more than that, the dog's entire demeanor had changed. His ears were flat, his tail low, and he approached the cabin with an almost reluctant gait, as if he was not quite sure he wanted to bring whatever he had found to his master's attention. "What you got there, boy?" Abel set down his cup and stepped off the porch. Scout dropped the object at Abel's feet and backed away, whining softly. Abel bent down, his knees protesting the movement, and picked up what the dog had retrieved. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. It was a piece of metal, roughly the size of his palm, but unlike any metal Abel had ever encountered. The surface was absolutely smooth, without any visible seam or forge mark, and it caught the morning light in a way that seemed almost liquid. The color shifted as he turned it, silver, then blue, then a deep purple, then back to silver again. Most remarkable was its weight, or rather the lack of it. The piece felt no heavier than a dry leaf, though it was clearly solid throughout. Abel ran his thumb across the surface. It was neither warm nor cold to the touch, but sat at some neutral temperature that his skin could barely register. When he tapped it with his fingernail, it produced no sound at all, as if the metal absorbed rather than reflected the force. He tried to bend it, applying as much pressure as his calloused hands could manage, but the metal remained perfectly rigid, showing not even a hint of flex. "Where'd you find this?" he asked Scout, but the dog only whined again and looked toward the western ridge. Abel tucked the metal into his coat pocket and made his way back into the cabin. He set the piece on the table and sat down, staring at it while his coffee grew cold. His practical mind worked through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. It could not be any metal he knew, not iron or steel or tin or silver or gold. The way it caught light reminded him vaguely of oil on water, that iridescent quality. But this was something else entirely, and the weight was all wrong. A piece this size should have heft to its substance, but this felt lighter than pine wood. He thought about the fireball, about the sound and the light and the impact he had felt through the ground. The connection was obvious, even to a man who prided himself on skepticism. Whatever had fallen from the sky last night, Scout had found a piece of it. The question that settled over Abel then was not what it was, but what to do about it. His first thought was to tell someone, Doc Pritchard perhaps, or even ride into town and show it to Samuel Chen, who was the closest thing Larkspur had to an educated man. But something held him back. He could not quite articulate the feeling, but it was similar to the instinct that sometimes warned him of coming weather or approaching danger. A sense that once this metal was known, once word spread, things would change in ways he could not control. Abel had seen what greed could do to men. He had seen mining camps tear themselves apart over gold strikes, seen families divided over inheritance, seen friendships end over money owed or land disputed. Whatever this metal was, whatever properties it possessed, it would draw attention. And attention, in Abel's experience, brought trouble more often than it brought good. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the pristine landscape. Somewhere out there, beyond the ridge, lay the source of this metal. Perhaps a great deal more of it, perhaps fragments scattered across acres of forest. If he told people, they would go looking. They would search and dig and claim and fight. The quiet order of Larkspur would be disrupted, perhaps destroyed. But could he simply bury this knowledge? Pretend he had never seen the fireball, never held this impossible metal? His conscience pushed back against that thought. What if this metal had value beyond mere curiosity? What if it could be used for good, for tools or medicine or purposes he could not even imagine? Did he have the right to make that decision alone? Abel thought of Margaret. She would have told him to follow his heart, to do what felt right rather than what felt safe. But Margaret had also believed in wonders, in possibilities beyond the ordinary world. Would she have seen this metal as a gift or a curse? He spent the morning doing his chores in a distracted state, his mind returning again and again to the metal sitting on his table. The cattle needed tending, the horses needed exercise, the chickens needed feed. Life continued in its routine patterns, but underneath it all, Abel felt the ground shifting, felt the first tremors of change. It was near noon when he made his decision. He would keep the metal to himself for now, at least until he understood more about what it was and what it could do. He would not lie if asked directly, but neither would he volunteer the information. It was a compromise, perhaps not entirely honest, but not entirely dishonest either. A middle path, which seemed appropriate for a man who had spent his life trying to avoid extremes. He wrapped the metal in a cloth and placed it in the drawer of his dresser, under his winter clothes. Out of sight but not forgotten. Then he saddled his horse and rode into town, ostensibly to pick up supplies, but really to gauge what people were saying about last night's skyfire. The general store was busy when he arrived. Samuel Chen greeted him with his usual courtesy, but Abel noticed the excitement in the storekeeper's eyes. "You see that last night?" Samuel asked without preamble. "That light in the sky." "Saw it," Abel confirmed. "Right spectacular. Meteor, most likely," Samuel said, warming to the topic. "I read about such things in a journal. Space rocks falling to Earth. Quite common, actually, though usually they burn up before reaching the ground. This one must have been large to make it all the way down." Others in the store chimed in with their own observations and theories. Most had seen the light, heard the boom. Some claimed to have felt their windows rattle. The general consensus seemed to be that it had landed somewhere in the forest west of town. but no one seemed particularly inclined to go looking for it in 3 feet of snow. Abel listened more than he spoke, filing away information and impressions. The excitement was already building, but it was still contained by winter's grip on the land and by the natural caution of people who had work to attend to. Come spring, though, when the snow melted and travel became easier, that might change. As he rode back to his homestead that afternoon, supplies loaded in his saddlebags, Abel felt the weight of his decision settle over him. He had bought himself time, but time for what? To decide what to do with the metal, certainly, but also to prepare for whatever came next, because something would come. The fireball had been too bright, too dramatic to simply fade from memory. And if Scout had found one piece of strange metal, others might find more. The sun was lowering toward the western peaks when Abel reached home. Scout met him at the gate, tail wagging, seemingly recovered from whatever unease had possessed him that morning. Abel unsaddled his horse, carried the supplies inside, and then stood for a long moment in his cabin, looking at the dresser drawer that held his secret. He thought again of Margaret, of her belief in wonders and mysteries. He thought of the town, of the people he knew and cared about. He thought of the life he had built here, steady and predictable and good. All of it felt suddenly fragile, balanced on the edge of change. Outside, the winter sun painted the snow in shades of gold and pink. Inside, Abel Givens poured himself a small whiskey and sat by the fire, knowing in his bones that the easy part was over. Now came the hard decisions, the kind that could not be unmade once chosen. The kind that defined a man's character more surely than any words or intentions. The watch ticked on the mantel. The fire crackled. Scout dozed. And somewhere in the dresser drawer, wrapped in cloth, a piece of impossible metal waited to change everything. 3 days passed, and Abel kept his secret. He went about his work with outward calm, but found himself drawn repeatedly to the dresser drawer, unwrapping the metal to study it in different lights and at different times of day. It never changed. Always that liquid shimmer, always that impossible lightness, always that complete silence when struck or scraped. He tried heating it in the fire one evening, holding it with tongs in the hottest part of the flames for a full 10 minutes. When he pulled it out, the metal showed no sign of damage or even warmth. It simply remained what it was, indifferent to his attempts at understanding. On the 4th morning, Abel noticed something odd. The potted geranium that Margaret had loved, the one he had kept alive more from sentiment than any real interest in flowers, had sprouted new blooms overnight. That in itself was remarkable enough. The plant usually went dormant in winter, barely surviving until spring. But what caught Abel's attention was the color of the flowers. Geraniums, in his experience, came in shades of red or pink or white. These were a deep, luminous blue, unlike anything he had seen in nature. He stood staring at the plant for a long moment, then slowly turned his gaze to the dresser. The metal was wrapped and hidden, but he had taken it out the night before, had sat at the table examining it by lamplight with the potted geranium not 3 feet away. Could there be a connection? It seemed impossible, yet here was the evidence. Abel cut one of the blue flowers and wrapped it carefully in paper, tucking it into his vest pocket. Then he rewrapped the metal and placed it back in the drawer, this time pushing it to the very back beneath layers of clothing. If the metal could affect plants from across a room, what else might it influence? And more importantly, what did that mean for him, living in the same cabin with it day after day? That afternoon, he rode into town with the excuse of needing to speak with Cora Mackenzie about a book she had mentioned lending him. In truth, he wanted to see if she noticed anything different about him, any sign that proximity to the metal had altered him in some way. It was a vague worry, the kind his practical mind wanted to dismiss but could not quite manage. Cora lived in a small house behind the schoolhouse, a tidy place with lace curtains and a garden that in summer produced vegetables enough to share with neighbors. She welcomed him in from the cold, offered coffee, and settled into her chair with the comfortable ease of someone accustomed to her own company. "You look troubled." "Abel," she said after a few minutes of small talk, "is everything all right?" He had always appreciated her directness. "Just thinking on things," he replied. "Getting older makes a man reflective, I suppose." 61 is not so old, Cora said with a slight smile. "My father lived to 83 and remained sharp until the very end. Your father was fortunate. He was also honest," Cora said, her eyes meeting his. When something bothered him, he talked about it rather than letting it fester. "I've always admired that quality." Abel sipped his coffee, considering how much to say. Cora was intelligent and discreet, qualities he valued. But she was also part of the community, connected to it in ways he was not. If he told her about the metal, could she keep that knowledge to herself? More importantly, should she? "Did you see that light in the sky a few nights back?" he asked, choosing an indirect path. "The meteor?" "Half the town saw it. Samuel Chen has been holding forth at the store about celestial phenomena and the scientific explanations for such things." She paused. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious about what people are thinking. People are thinking it was remarkable, and now they've moved on to other concerns. Winter has a way of keeping folks focused on immediate needs." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You're not usually one for idle curiosity about town gossip, Abel." He smiled despite himself. "No, I suppose not. So what's really on your mind?" Abel set down his coffee cup. "If you found something unusual, something you didn't quite understand, would you tell people about it, or would you keep it to yourself until you knew more?" Cora was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "That would depend on what the thing was, and what keeping it secret might mean. If it was dangerous, I would feel obligated to warn others. If it was merely curious, I might study it privately before deciding. And if it was both," Abel asked, "both curious and potentially dangerous?" "Then I would seek counsel from someone I trusted," Cora said. "Someone with wisdom enough to help me think through the implications." She met his eyes again. "Is there something you want to tell me, Abel?" He considered it, came close to pulling the blue flower from his pocket and explaining everything. But caution held him back. Not distrust of Cora, but uncertainty about his own judgment. What if the flower was a coincidence? What if his isolation was making him see connections that did not exist? "Better to be certain before involving others, just thinking out loud," he said finally. "Pay me no mind." Cora did not look entirely convinced, but she respected his privacy enough not to push. They talked of other things for another half hour, the upcoming town meeting about road maintenance, the progress of her students, a new family that had arrived on the last train from the east, normal things, the everyday concerns of community life. It should have been comforting, but Abel found himself feeling distant from it all, as if he were already separating from the world he knew, when he rode home that evening. The sun setting behind the western peaks. He found Scout waiting by the barn door with something in his mouth. Abel's heart sank even before he dismounted. Another piece of metal, this one slightly larger than the first, with the same impossible properties and shifting colors. "Where did you find this?" Abel asked, though he knew the dog could not answer. Scout looked toward the western ridge, then back at Abel, then whined softly. It was as clear a communication as the dog could manage. "There is more out there, and you need to see it." Abel stood holding the second piece of metal, feeling the weight of inevitability settle over him. He could not keep this secret much longer. If Scout could find the metal, others would too, especially once the snow began to melt. And if the metal affected plants the way the geranium suggested, there would be visible evidence in the spring, strange blooms, unusual growth patterns, things that would draw attention and questions. He looked at his homestead, at the cabin and barn and corrals, at the life he had built. It felt suddenly precarious, like a house of cards, awaiting the breath of wind that would scatter it. Change was coming, whether he willed it or not. The only question was whether he would meet it head-on or wait for it to overtake him. That night, Abel took both pieces of metal from the dresser and wrapped them together in oilcloth, then placed them in the root cellar beneath the cabin. More distance, more separation from his living space. But even as he did so, he knew it was a futile gesture. The metal's influence could not be contained by walls or cloth, or his own stubborn desire for things to remain as they were. He sat by the fire until late, Scout at his feet, and thought about responsibility and consequence, about the choices a man makes when circumstances push him beyond the comfortable boundaries of his life. Outside, the Montana winter held the land in its grip. Inside, Abel Givens faced the dawning realization that his time of easy decisions had ended. Tomorrow, he would ride to the western ridge and see for himself what Scout had found. Tomorrow, he would stop hiding from the truth and face whatever waited in those woods. Because a man could run from many things, but running from himself was not one of them. Margaret had taught him that years ago, and it remained true now. The ride to the western ridge took most of the morning. The snow was deep and the going slow, even with his most sure-footed horse. Scout ranged ahead, breaking trail where he could, circling back periodically to make sure Abel was following. The dog knew where they were going, and there was an urgency in his movements that Abel had rarely seen. The forest climbed the ridge in dense stands of pine and fir, their branches heavy with snow. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of hooves and the occasional call of a raven. Abel had hunted these woods for years, knew most of the game trails and good spots for camping. But today, the familiar landscape felt different, charged with an expectation he could not quite name. Scout led him to a clearing about 2 miles into the forest, a natural break in the trees where a small stream ran in warmer months. Now it was frozen and buried under snow, but the open space provided a clear view of what had happened 4 nights ago. A swath of destruction cut through the forest. Trees snapped and scattered. Snow melted in a radius of perhaps 30 yards around a central point. At the center of it all was a crater, roughly circular and maybe 15 feet across. Abel dismounted and approached slowly, leading his horse. The impact site showed signs that whatever had fallen here had been intensely hot. The ground was bare of snow in places, showing scorched earth and blackened rock. But most remarkably, growing from the crater itself were plants. Not winter-dormant vegetation, but lush green growth that seemed to pulse with vitality in the cold air. Abel recognized clover and wild grasses, even what looked like early wildflowers, all impossibly alive in the dead of winter. He knelt at the edge of the crater and saw immediately what Scout had been finding. Scattered throughout the impact site were fragments of the strange metal, some as small as coins, others as large as dinner plates. They lay half-buried in the churned earth, catching the weak winter sun and throwing back colors that had no name. Abel reached out and picked up a piece about the size of his fist. It had the same properties as the smaller fragments, weightless, color-shifting, temperature-neutral. But this close to the source, with dozens of pieces surrounding him, he felt something else. A subtle vibration, almost below the threshold of perception, like standing near a hive of bees. Not threatening, but alive somehow, active in ways he could not articulate. He stood slowly, surveying the crash site. This was what he had feared and in some deep part of himself expected. The metal was not just unusual, it was powerful. Powerful enough to bring life to dead winter, powerful enough to change the very nature of growing things. What else might it do? What other properties did it possess? A sound made him turn. Tom Hutchins, the sheriff, was riding into the clearing from the eastern side, his horse picking its way carefully through the disturbed ground. The lawman's face registered surprise when he saw Abel, then settled into something more guarded. "Givens," Hutchins said by way of greeting. "Didn't expect to find anyone out here." "Could say the same about you, Sheriff." Hutchins dismounted and walked to the edge of the crater, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "Would you look at that?" he breathed. "Green grass in January, and those flowers," he broke off, shaking his head. "What in God's name happened here?" "Same thing that lit up the sky a few nights back," Abel said. "Whatever fell from the heavens landed here." The sheriff crouched down and picked up a piece of the metal, turning it over in his hands. Abel watched him carefully, saw the same fascination and confusion he himself had experienced. "This ain't like any rock I ever seen," Hutchins said. "Feels wrong somehow." "Too light." "Put it down, Tom," The sheriff looked up, surprised by the firmness in Abel's tone. Why? Because we don't know what it is or what it does. And until we do, seems wise to be cautious. Hutchins studied the metal a moment longer, then set it back on the ground. You always were the careful type, Abel, but seems to me this is something folks ought to know about. This metal, these plants growing in winter, could be valuable, could be important, could be dangerous, Abel countered. You got reason to think that? Abel considered how much to say. They got reason to think we should move slow and think careful before we go stirring up a hornet's nest. This kind of thing, word gets out, people will come from all over looking for pieces. You want that kind of chaos in Larkspur? Hutchins was quiet for a moment, and Abel could see the calculation going on behind his eyes. The sheriff was not a bad man, but he was ambitious in small ways, the kind of ambition that sought recognition and importance. Finding something like this could make a man's reputation, could turn a small-town sheriff into someone people talked about. People got a right to know, Hutchins said finally. Can't keep something like this secret. Not talking about keeping it secret forever, Abel said. Just talking about being smart. Give us time to understand what we're dealing with before we open it up to every fortune hunter and curiosity seeker between here and California. How much time? A few weeks. Maybe a month. Long enough to see what these plants do, whether this metal is safe to handle, whether there's any danger we need to account for. Hutchins shook his head. Can't do that, Abel. My duty is to report things like this. There's probably government people who should know about it. Scientists, maybe, or someone from the university down in Missoula. Your duty is to keep this town safe, Abel said quietly. And right now, I'm not sure if bringing a bunch of strangers here serves that purpose. They stood facing each other across the crater, and Abel saw the moment when Hutchins made his decision. The sheriff's jaw set, and he straightened his shoulders. I appreciate your concern, Abel, I do. But this is beyond us. This needs to be handled by people who understand such things. You're making a mistake. Maybe so. But it's my mistake to make. Hutchins walked back to his horse, then paused and looked back. You're a good man, Givens. Always have been. But you can't control everything. Some things are bigger than one man's judgment. Abel watched him ride away, feeling a cold certainty settle in his chest. He had tried caution, tried discretion, and it had bought him less than a week. By tomorrow, half the town would know about the crash site. By the end of the week, word would spread to neighboring towns. And then the flood would begin. Prospectors, scientists, the merely curious, all descending on Larkspur like locusts on a wheat field. He looked around the clearing one more time, at the impossible plants and the scattered metal, at the evidence of something beyond his understanding or control. Scout whined softly and pressed against his leg, as if sensing his master's distress. It's all right, boy, Abel said, though he was not sure he believed it. We did what we could. But as he mounted his horse and began the long ride back to his homestead, Abel knew that the time for doing what he could was over. Now came the time for dealing with consequences, for navigating waters he had hoped to avoid. The easy path, if it had ever existed, was closed to him now. The sun was past its peak when he reached home. He unsaddled his horse, tended to the barn, and went inside to find the cabin exactly as he had left it. Everything in its place, everything ordered and familiar. But it felt different now, like the still moment before a storm, when the air grows heavy and the birds fall silent. Abel sat by the window and watched the light fade from the western sky. Somewhere beyond those ridges, Tom Hutchins was riding back to town with news that would change everything. And here, in his quiet cabin with his aging dog and his memories, Abel Givens prepared himself for the change he had tried and failed to prevent. The watch on the mantel ticked away the seconds. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, the Montana winter held its breath. And Abel, who had lived his life trying to do right by himself and others, wondered if he had just made the worst decision of all, the decision to try to stop something that could not be stopped. The news spread through Larkspur faster than Abel had anticipated. By the next morning, small groups were already organizing expeditions to the crash site, and by afternoon, The Silver Spur saloon was packed with men arguing about who had rights to the metal and what it might be worth. Abel stayed away from town, but Cora rode out to his place that evening with a basket of bread and a worried expression. "You knew about this," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him. "That conversation we had about keeping secrets, you were talking about the metal." Abel nodded slowly. "I was trying to understand it before word got out, trying to be careful. And now Tom Hutchins has half the town in a frenzy." She shook her head. "Doc Pritchard went out to the site this morning and came back talking about miracles. Said he saw plants growing that have no business being alive in winter. Said the metal feels like nothing he's ever encountered in his medical training." "It's more than unusual," Abel said quietly. "It's something else entirely." Cora reached into her coat and pulled out a small piece of the metal, setting it on the table between them. Abel felt his stomach tighten. "Where did you get that?" "Samuel Chen. He went out to the site yesterday evening and brought back a handful of pieces. He's already selling them in the store. 50 cents for the small ones, $2 for the larger pieces." She looked at Abel with troubled eyes. "People are buying them like candy, Abel, treating them like curiosities or good luck charms. They don't know what they're doing. Then tell them. You're one of the few people in this town everyone respects. If you speak up about the dangers—" "What dangers?" Abel interrupted. "That's the problem, Cora. I don't know if it's dangerous or not. I've been living with pieces of it in my cabin for days, and nothing bad has happened. The opposite, actually." He told her about the geranium, about the blue flowers that had no business existing. Cora was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between Abel and the piece of metal on the table. "Then it has properties beyond the physical. It affects living things, seems that way. That could be valuable, Abel, really valuable. If it can make plants grow in winter, what else might it do? Could it help crops? Could it heal sickness?" Her voice grew more animated as she worked through the possibilities. "This could change everything for Larkspur from Montana. We could—" She stopped suddenly, seeing the expression on Abel's face. "You don't look like a man contemplating good fortune." "I'm contemplating what happens when fortune turns to greed," Abel said. "I've seen it before, Cora. Gold rushes, silver strikes, land grabs. People lose themselves when they think wealth is within reach. They forget who they are, what they believe in. They forget their neighbors and their conscience. Not everyone. Not you. I'm just one man. You're the man people listen to." Cora leaned forward. "If this metal can do what you say it can, then it needs to be understood and managed properly. Not hoarded, not fought over, but studied and used for the common good. You could lead that effort, Abel. You could be the voice that keeps people honest." Abel wanted to believe her. He wanted to think that reason and common sense would prevail, that the people of Larkspur would handle this discovery with wisdom and restraint. But he had lived too long and seen too much to trust in such optimism. "People won't listen to me when there's money involved. Then we make sure it's not about money." Cora picked up the metal and turned it over in her hands, the colors shifting in the lamplight. "We make it about something bigger. About community, about responsibility, about using this gift, if that's what it is, for more than personal gain." Before Abel could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching fast. He stood and went to the window, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle mounted above the door. 3 riders were coming up the path, and even in the fading light, he recognized Tom Hutchins in the lead. The other 2 were men he knew only by sight, drifters who had been working odd jobs around town for the past month. Abel stepped out onto the porch as the riders pulled up. Hutchins dismounted, and Abel could see the tension in the sheriff's shoulders, the way his hand rested near his pistol. "Evening, Abel, Miss Mackenzie." "Tom." Abel's voice was carefully neutral. "What brings you out this way?" "Need to talk to you about the metal." "About how much you've collected." "I've collected 2 pieces, both found by my dog. They're in the root cellar if you want to verify." "That's not what I heard." Hutchins glanced at the 2 men with him, and Abel felt warning bells go off in his head. "Word is, you knew about the crash site before anyone else. That you've been out there multiple times, taking pieces for yourself." "That's a lie," Abel said quietly. I went to the site once yesterday, same time you did. These men say different. Say they've been watching the site, saw tracks leading back this direction multiple times over the past few days. Abel looked at the two drifters, saw the calculation in their eyes. They were lying, of course, probably at someone else's instigation, but proving that would be difficult. Scout's been out there, he admitted. He's the one who found the first pieces and brought them back. But I haven't taken anything beyond what the dog retrieved. Mind if we search the place? Hutchins asked, just to settle things. It was not really a question, and Abel knew it. He could refuse, stand on his rights as a property owner, but that would only make him look guilty and escalate the tension. Help yourself, he said, stepping aside. Cora's inside, and I'd appreciate if you treated her with respect. The search did not take long. Hutchins and his men went through the cabin methodically, rough but not destructive. They found the two pieces in the root cellar, just as Abel had said, and nothing more. When they finished, Hutchins had the decency to look embarrassed. Appears you were telling the truth, the sheriff said. My apologies for the inconvenience. Who told you to come out here, Tom? Hutchins hesitated, then shook his head. Can't say. But there's talk in town, Abel. People wondering why you tried to keep the crash site secret. Wondering if you're sitting on more metal than you're letting on. People or one specific person? The sheriff mounted his horse without answering. Stay clear of the crash site for now. Town council's meeting tomorrow to decide how to handle this situation. They'll probably want to hear from you. He tipped his hat to Cora and rode off, his companions following. Abel stood on the porch long after they had disappeared into the dusk. Cora came out and stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. Someone's stirring trouble, she said. Jake Marston would be my guess. He sees money in this, wants to control the supply. Abel rubbed his face, suddenly feeling every one of his 61 years. This is just the beginning, Cora. Before long we'll have every opportunist and scoundrel in Montana descending on Larkspur. Then we prepare for it. We organize. We make sure the metal is distributed fairly and used responsibly. You make it sound simple. I don't think it's simple at all, Cora said. But I think it's necessary. And I think you're the right man to lead the effort, whether you want to be or not. That night, after Cora had ridden back to town, Abel sat with the two pieces of metal, studying them in the firelight. He thought about Margaret, about the life they had built together, about the values she had tried to instill in him. She had always believed that a man's character was revealed not in easy times, but in hard ones. Not in success, but in adversity. He thought about the town, about the people he knew and cared about the community that had been his home for 30 years. Larkspur was a good place, built on honest work and decent values. But he had seen good places corrupted before, seen communities tear themselves apart over less than what was now at stake. The metal gleamed in the firelight, beautiful and mysterious and dangerous in ways he was only beginning to understand. Scout lay at his feet, content in the simple presence of his master. Outside, the Montana winter continued its cold embrace. And inside, Abel Givens wrestled with a question that had no easy answer. When faced with something beyond understanding, beyond control, what was a man supposed to do? The town council meeting was held in the church, the only building large enough to hold the crowd that showed up. Abel arrived early, hoping to speak with some of the council members before things got started, but found the pews already half full and the mood tense. People were divided into visible camps, those who wanted to exploit the metal for profit, those who wanted it studied and controlled, and a smaller group who seemed frightened by the whole business and wanted it buried or destroyed. Father Michaels called the meeting to order, his young face trying for authority it had not yet fully earned. We're here to discuss the situation regarding the celestial object that fell near our town, he began, and to determine how Larkspur should proceed. The discussion started calmly enough, but quickly devolved into argument. Jake Marston proposed forming a company to mine the crash site and sell the metal to the highest bidders. This is opportunity, people, he said, his salesman's voice carrying to the back pews. We'd be fools not to capitalize on it. Every town in Montana would trade places with us right now. Samuel Chen countered that the metal should be studied first, that rushing to commercialize it without understanding its properties was reckless. We don't know what it is or where it came from. We don't know if it's safe to handle or what long-term effects it might have. It's been 4 days, Marston shot back. Nobody's grown a third arm yet. Seems safe enough to me. The argument went back and forth, with various townspeople adding their voices to one side or the other. Abel sat quietly listening, measuring the temperature of the room. He noticed that Doc Pritchard was not in attendance, which struck him as odd, given the medical implications of the metal's properties. It was Cora who finally stood and called for his input. Abel Givens has more experience than most of us in dealing with unusual situations. I think we should hear what he has to say. All eyes turned to him. Abel rose slowly, choosing his words carefully. I understand the excitement, he said, and I understand the desire to see Larkspur benefit from this discovery. But I've seen what happens when people rush toward fortune without thinking about consequence. I saw it in the gold camps, saw it in the cattle wars, saw it in places where good people forgot themselves because they were focused on getting rich. This ain't about getting rich, someone called from the back. This is about survival, about giving our families a better life, is it? Abel asked. Or is it about wanting more than we need? There's a difference, and it's one worth considering. The debate continued for another hour, growing more heated as tempers frayed. Finally, the council decided to form a committee to oversee access to the crash site and distribution of the metal, with Abel reluctantly agreeing to serve as chairman. It was not a position he wanted, but he could see no alternative that did not result in chaos. As people were filing out of the church, Doc Pritchard's wife Sarah rushed in, her face flushed and her eyes wide. You need to come, she said, grabbing the doctor's arm. Abel realized Pritchard had slipped in during the meeting. It's Emma Hartley. She's asking for Abel specifically. Abel's chest tightened. Emma Hartley was 7 years old, the daughter of Bill and Martha Hartley, who ran the livery stable. The child had been sick since autumn, wasting away from what Doc Pritchard had diagnosed as consumption. Last Abel heard, she was not expected to see spring. He followed the Pritchards through the snow to the Hartley home, a small house on the eastern edge of town. Martha met them at the door, and Abel could see she had been crying, but there was something else in her expression too. Something like wonder. Emma was sitting up in bed, and the change in her was remarkable. A week ago she had been pale and hollow-cheeked, barely strong enough to speak. Now her color was better, her eyes brighter, and she was holding something in her small hands, a piece of the strange metal. No bigger than a silver dollar, Mr. Givens, she said, her voice stronger than Abel had heard in months. Look what Papa brought me. He said it fell from the stars. Bill Hartley stood by the window, his face a mixture of hope and fear. Got it from Samuel's store yesterday, he said. Thought it might cheer her up. Something pretty to look at. She's been holding it ever since, and... He broke off, unable to continue. Doc Pritchard examined Emma with practiced hands, checking her pulse, listening to her breathing, looking at her throat and eyes. When he stepped back, he was shaking his head in disbelief. Her fever's broken. The inflammation in her lungs is reduced. She's not cured, but she's improved more in 1 day than she has in the past 3 months. He looked at the metal in Emma's hands. It's not possible. But it happened, Martha said, tears streaming down her face. Whatever that metal is, it's helping her. It's saving her. Abel felt the weight of the moment settle over him. If the metal could do this, if it could heal the sick, could restore health where medicine failed, then this was not just about commerce or curiosity. This was about something far more profound, far more dangerous in its implications. How many sick people were in Montana? How many in the country? How many desperate parents would do anything to get their hands on pieces of this metal? He sat down heavily in the chair Bill offered, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Emma watched him with her bright eyes, still holding the metal. Are you all right, Mr. Givens? She asked with a child's concern for adult distress. I'm fine, sweetheart, Abel said, managing a smile. Just thinking on things. Papa says you're going to make sure everyone gets to use the star metal, Emma said. That you'll make sure it's fair. Abel looked at Bill, who had the grace to appear embarrassed. Might have mentioned you were on the committee, Bill said. People trust you, Abel. They know you'll do right by them. On the ride back to his homestead that night, Abel thought about trust and responsibility, about the burden that came with other people's faith. He had not asked for this role, had tried to avoid it, but circumstances had pushed him to the front regardless. The metal was not going away. The people's hopes and fears were not going away. The only question was whether he had the wisdom and strength to navigate what came next. Scout met him at the barn, tail wagging, and Abel took comfort in the dog's simple presence. Whatever else changed, whatever else was demanded of him, he still had this, his land, his home, his dog, the anchors that kept him grounded when everything else seemed to shift beneath his feet. He went inside and added wood to the fire, then sat in his chair with Margaret's watch in his hands. He thought about what she would have told him to do, how she would have advised him to face this challenge. Be honest, she would have said. Be fair. Do what your conscience tells you is right, not what's easy or popular. And trust that goodness exists in people, even when circumstances bring out the worst in them. Outside, the winter night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds on velvet. Somewhere up there, Abel thought, was where the metal had come from. Not from any earthly source, but from the heavens themselves, or at least from somewhere beyond human understanding. Whether that made it a blessing or a curse, he could not yet say. But he was beginning to suspect that, like most profound things, it might be both. 2 weeks after Emma Hartley's remarkable recovery, Abel began noticing changes in people who had acquired pieces of the metal. Nothing dramatic at first, just small alterations in behavior and temperament. Samuel Chen, who had been selling the metal from his store, became withdrawn and distracted, spending hours staring at the piece he kept for himself. Jake Marston grew increasingly territorial about his collection, keeping armed men at his saloon and refusing to let anyone see what he had accumulated. Even Bill Hartley, grateful as he was for his daughter's recovery, had become possessive of the piece Emma held, refusing to let Doc Pritchard examine it more closely. Abel might have dismissed these observations as the natural human response to something valuable, except that he noticed the same patterns in himself. He found his thoughts drifting to the metal at odd moments, felt an almost physical pull toward the root cellar where he kept his pieces. More troubling were the dreams, vivid, strange dreams of lights and patterns, of vast distances and purposes he could not articulate upon waking. It was Scout who finally made him see the truth. The dog had been agitated for days, pacing the cabin and whining at the door that led to the root cellar. One morning, Abel woke to find Scout had somehow opened that door and was sitting at the top of the cellar stairs, staring down into the darkness and growling low in his throat. Abel descended the stairs with a lantern, Scout reluctantly following. The 2 pieces of metal he had stored in an old crate were glowing faintly in the darkness, pulsing with a soft blue light that had not been there before. And they had moved. Not far, just a few inches, but enough to be unmistakable. The pieces were trying to get closer to each other, drawn together by some force or intention Abel could not fathom. He picked up one piece, and the moment his skin made contact, he felt it. A vibration, a sense of awareness, of purpose. The metal was not dead matter. It was not inert. It was something alive, or at least something with qualities so close to life that the distinction became meaningless. And it wanted something. It wanted to be whole again. Abel set the piece down carefully and backed away, his heart pounding. If his 2 small fragments were trying to reunite, what about all the other pieces scattered throughout Larkspur? What about the larger fragments still at the crash site? Were they all being drawn together? And what would happen if they succeeded in reassembling themselves? He went directly to Cora's house, not bothering with social niceties. She was preparing for the school day when he arrived, and took one look at his face before sending her students home and inviting him inside. "The metal's not what we thought," Abel said without preamble. He told her about the glow, the movement, the sensation of awareness. It's trying to reform itself. All the pieces people have been taking, they're not separate objects. They're parts of something larger, something that's still active. Cora sat down slowly, her face troubled. You're saying it's alive? I'm saying it has purpose. Whether that makes it alive in the way we understand life, I couldn't tell you. But it's not just metal. It never was. Does it mean us harm? I don't know, Abel admitted. The healing, the plants growing, that doesn't seem harmful. But the way it's affecting people, the way it pulls at them, he shook his head. Margaret used to say that the most dangerous things in the world were the ones that gave you what you wanted while taking something you didn't realize you valued. That's what this feels like. They went to Doc Pritchard's office and found him conducting an experiment. He had acquired 6 pieces of metal from various townspeople and had arranged them in a row on his examination table. As Abel and Cora watched, the pieces slowly shifted position, moving toward each other with incremental but deliberate motion. I've been observing this for 3 days, Pritchard said, his voice carrying the excitement of scientific discovery mixed with underlying unease. They move faster at night, and they're not just attracted to each other, they're trying to form a specific pattern. Look. He showed them sketches he had made, documenting the pieces' movements over time. They're not just clustering randomly. They're organizing themselves into a structure, like they remember what they used to be part of. What about the people who own these pieces? Abel asked. Have you noticed changes in them? Pritchard's excitement faded. Obsession, mostly. An unwillingness to part with the metal, even temporarily. Mrs. Henderson brought me her piece to examine, then became so agitated when I wouldn't return it immediately that I thought she might become violent. And that's not like her. She's normally one of the gentlest souls in town. Abel felt the pieces falling into place, a pattern emerging that he did not like. We need to go to the crash site. We need to see what's at the center of all this. They rode out that afternoon. Abel, Cora, and Doc Pritchard, with Tom Hutchins grudgingly agreeing to come along as official representation. The forest trail was more traveled now, packed down by the dozens of people who had made the journey to collect metal. But when they reached the clearing, they found it deserted. Word had spread that the easily accessible pieces were gone, and the dig had moved deeper into the crater itself. What they found there made Abel's blood run cold. Someone, probably Jake Marston's men, had excavated the center of the impact site, digging down 10 feet or more through frozen earth. And there, partially exposed, was the source of all the fragments. It was not a meteorite. It was something crafted, something purposeful in its design, a sphere roughly 6 feet in diameter, its surface covered in the same shifting colors as the fragments but marked with patterns. That might have been writing or circuitry or something. Beyond human categorization, the sphere was intact except for the damaged section where pieces had broken off during impact, and it was humming. Not loudly, but persistently, a vibration Abel could feel in his bones. More remarkable was the way the few remaining fragments scattered around the crater were slowly moving toward it, pulled by whatever force emanated from the sphere itself. Sweet mercy, Hutchins breathed. What in God's name is that thing? I think, Doc Pritchard said slowly, that it's a vessel of some kind, or perhaps a seed. Something designed to travel great distances, and then he paused, struggling for words. And then grow, transform. I don't know the right term. Abel approached the sphere carefully, and as he drew near, he felt the pull intensify. Not just the physical attraction of the metal fragments in his pocket, but something deeper, a pull on his thoughts, his intentions, his very sense of self. The sphere wanted him to come closer, wanted him to touch it, wanted him to help it achieve whatever purpose it had been designed for. He stopped at the crater's edge, resisting the urge. We need to make a decision, he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his mind. We need to decide what we're going to do about this, and we need to decide fast, because every piece of metal people are carrying around town is part of this thing. And if I'm right about what's happening, those pieces are going to keep trying to return here. Which means the people carrying them are going to be compelled to bring them back. You're talking about possession, Cora said. About people losing control of their own actions. I'm talking about influence, Abel corrected. Strong enough that it might as well be the same thing. They stood at the edge of the crater as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the peaks. 4 people facing a problem that exceeded anything in their experience or understanding. The sphere hummed its patient song, calling to the scattered pieces of itself, calling to anyone who might help it become whole again. And in Larkspur, men and women went about their business, unaware that they were carrying fragments of something that would not rest until it had reclaimed what belonged to it. Abel thought of Emma Hartley, holding her piece of metal, her health restored but her will slowly bending towards something beyond her understanding. He thought of all the people who had bought or found fragments, who kept them close out of hope or greed or simple fascination. He thought of the choice that lay before him now, to protect the sphere and allow it to complete whatever purpose it had been sent here to achieve, or to destroy it and risk losing everything it might offer, including the miracle of healing that had saved a child's life. The weight of that choice pressed down on him like a physical burden. And as the winter sun painted the snow in shades of gold and crimson, Abel Givens understood that his time of easy decisions was truly over. The committee meeting that night was the most contentious Larkspur had ever witnessed. Abel laid out what they had discovered at the crash site, describing the sphere and its properties as clearly as he could. The reactions ranged from fascination to fear to outright disbelief. "You're telling us that thing is calling to the pieces people have?" Jake Marston demanded. "That it's influencing their thoughts?" "I'm saying there's a connection between the pieces and the sphere that goes beyond physical attraction," Abel replied. "And that connection seems to affect the people who possess the fragments." "That's superstitious nonsense," Marston shot back. "It's metal. Strange metal, sure, but metal nonetheless. It doesn't think. It doesn't want anything." "Then explain why the pieces move on their own," Doc Pritchard interjected. "Explain why they organize themselves into patterns. Explain why people who handle them report dreams and compulsions they can't account for." The debate went on for hours, but ultimately the town split into 2 clear factions. One group, led by Marston, believed the sphere should be studied and potentially exploited if it was some kind of advanced technology. Understanding it could make Larkspur and its residents wealthy beyond imagination. The other group, smaller but more vocal, believed it should be buried or destroyed before it caused more harm. Abel listened to both sides, then spoke the truth that had been forming in his mind since seeing the sphere. "I don't think we can destroy it. I tried scratching one of the small pieces with the hardest tools I own. Nothing marked it. If we can't damage a fragment, I doubt we can harm the whole sphere." "Then we bury it," someone suggested. "Cover it up, seal the entrance to the crater, and forget it exists." "That won't work either," Cora said quietly. "The fragments will still pull toward it. People will still be drawn here. And if we try to prevent that, we'll have to take the metal away from everyone who possesses it, including Emma Hartley," the name hung in the air. Emma was the living proof of the metal's beneficial properties, the miracle that gave hope to anyone suffering from illness. Taking away her fragment might mean her death. Could any of them justify that choice? "There's another possibility," Abel said slowly. "We complete it. We gather all the fragments and return them to the sphere. Let it become whole again and see what it does." The silence that followed was profound. It was Father Michaels who finally spoke. "You're proposing we help something we don't understand, achieve a purpose we know nothing about." "That's madness," Marston finished. "Or faith, depending on how you look at it." "It's neither," Abel said. "It's pragmatism. The sphere wants to be whole. The fragments want to return. Fighting that is like fighting the tide. We might delay it, but we can't stop it. So instead of resisting, we control the process. We decide when and how the reunion happens, and we prepare for whatever comes next." Tom Hutchins shook his head. "And if what comes next is something that destroys the town? If that thing is dangerous? Then we were in danger from the moment it fell from the sky," Abel replied. "At least this way we face it on our terms, rather than being surprised by it." The vote was close, but Abel's pragmatism won out. They would gather the fragments over the next 3 days and transport them to the crash site. Anyone who refused to surrender their pieces would be, the committee struggled with this, strongly encouraged. It was not a perfect solution, but it was the only one that acknowledged the reality of their situation. The hardest part was convincing individuals to give up their metal. Bill Hartley was among the most resistant. Abel rode out to the livery stable the next morning and found Bill in his workshop, a rifle across his lap and a hard look in his eyes. "Come to take my daughter's salvation?" Bill asked, his voice tight. Abel dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Come to talk, Bill, just talk." "Nothing to talk about. Emma's getting better because of that metal. You take it away. She goes back to dying." "I won't allow that." Abel sat down on a hay bale, taking his time. "I know what you're feeling. If I had a child and that child was sick, I'd do anything to save them. Anything at all. But that's not what's happening here, Bill. You see her? She's playing outside, running around like she hasn't been able to do in months. That metal saved her life. Maybe it did. Or maybe it's just delaying the inevitable while taking something else from her." Abel leaned forward. "Have you noticed changes in Emma beyond the physical? Have you noticed how she talks about the metal? How she won't let it out of her sight?" Bill's jaw tightened and Abel knew he had struck a nerve. "She's attached to it." "That's natural. Is it, or is the metal attached to her? Using her to stay mobile, to stay protected?" Abel kept his voice gentle. "I'm not saying the healing isn't real. I'm not saying we should destroy what's helping your daughter. I'm saying we need to understand what we're dealing with before we let it become too deeply rooted in our lives." Martha Hartley appeared in the doorway, Emma beside her. The child looked healthier than Abel had seen her in months, but there was something in her eyes, a distance, a focus that seemed directed inward or elsewhere. She was holding the metal fragment, and her grip on it was white-knuckled. "Emma," Abel said gently, "how are you feeling?" "It wants to go home," the child said, her voice strange and flat. "It's been calling, and now it's almost time." Martha's hand went to her throat. "Emma, what are you talking about?" But the girl did not seem to hear her mother. Her eyes were fixed on some point beyond the walls, beyond the town. "All the pieces want to go home. They're tired of being scattered. They want to be whole again and complete their work." Abel felt a chill run down his spine. He approached Emma slowly and knelt down to her level. "What work, sweetheart? What is it trying to do?" Emma looked at him then, and for a moment he saw his young friend behind her eyes. "I don't know, Mr. Givens, but it's important. More important than anything." Then the distance returned. 3 days. "It will be ready in 3 days." Bill had gone pale. He looked at his daughter as if seeing her clearly for the first time in weeks. "Abel," his voice broke. "What's happening to her?" "The metal's influence is stronger than we thought," Abel said quietly, "and it's growing stronger as more pieces gather. That's why we need to complete the reunion now, while we can still think clearly enough to make our own decisions." It took another hour of conversation, but Bill finally agreed to bring Emma's fragment to the crash site when the time came. Similar conversations happened all over Larkspur over the next 2 days, some easier, some harder, all of them requiring Abel to convince people to give up something they had come to depend on or desire. Cora was his steady companion through it all, helping with the more delicate conversations, providing support when Abel's patience threatened to fray. On the evening of the second day, as they sat in her small kitchen drinking coffee, she said, "You're carrying too much of this alone." "Seems to be my lot," Abel replied, managing a tired smile. "It doesn't have to be. Let others share the burden. Let me share it." Abel looked at her, this strong, intelligent woman who had become such an important part of his life without him quite noticing when it happened. "You already do," he said. "More than you know." She reached across the table and took his hand, a simple gesture that carried weight. "Whatever happens at that crater, I'll be there with you. It might be dangerous. Most worthwhile things are." She squeezed his hand. "You're not alone in this, Abel. Remember that." The night before they were to take the fragments to the sphere, Abel sat in his cabin with Scout and thought about Margaret. He pulled out her watch and held it, remembering conversations they had shared about duty and choice, about doing right, even when right was hard to determine. What would she say about tomorrow? Would she approve of his decision to complete the sphere, or would she counsel caution? But he knew deep down what Margaret would say. She would tell him to follow his conscience, to do what he believed was right, regardless of the outcome. She would tell him that a man's character was measured not by the choices he made in certainty, but by the choices he made in doubt. And she would remind him that some things were worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. He thought about the town, about the people who lived here and the community they had built together. Larkspur was not perfect, no place was, but it was home. It was the ground he had chosen to stand on, the place where he had decided his life would matter. If the sphere threatened that, he would stand against it. If it offered blessing, he would help shepherd that blessing. But either way, he would not run. He would not hide. He had done enough of both in his younger years to know they solved nothing. Outside, the winter stars shone cold and distant. Inside, Abel Givens prepared himself for whatever tomorrow would bring, knowing that some decisions, once made, could never be unmade. Knowing that by noon tomorrow, the town of Larkspur would be changed forever, for better or worse. And knowing that he, more than anyone, would bear responsibility for whatever that change entailed. Scout whined softly and pressed against his leg. Abel rested his hand on the dog's head, drawing comfort from the simple, uncomplicated loyalty of the animal. Whatever else happened, he still had this. He still had the things that mattered: friendship, conscience, the strength to face hard truths. Margaret had helped him build those foundations. Now he would see if they were strong enough to hold. The morning of the third day dawned clear and cold, the kind of winter morning that made every breath visible and every sound carry across the frozen landscape. Abel stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as wagons and riders arrived, bearing the metal fragments. Nearly 70 pieces in all, collected from homes and businesses throughout Larkspur. Some came willingly. Others required the gentle but firm insistence of the committee. A few, like Jake Marston, had to be convinced at gunpoint by Tom Hutchins that the common good outweighed personal gain. The fragments were placed in wooden crates lined with cloth. Though Abel noticed, they had arranged themselves during transport, orienting toward the crater with what seemed like deliberate intent. People who had carried the metal looked both relieved and bereft, as if a weight had been lifted, but something precious had been lost. Emma Hartley was the last to arrive, her parents flanking her like guards. The child walked steadily, but her eyes had that distant look Abel had come to recognize, the look of someone only partially present in their own body. She carried her fragment openly, no longer concealing it, no longer treating it as a talisman, but rather as something that had a will of its own. "It's time," Emma said, her voice carrying the strange flatness of the sphere's influence. "All the pieces are here. It can be whole again." Abel approached her slowly, kneeling to her level. "Emma, I need you to listen to me. Really listen. Not the metal talking through you, but you yourself. Do you understand what's about to happen?" For a moment, the distance in her eyes cleared and he saw his friend again. "I'm scared, Mr. Givens," she whispered. "It's in my head all the time now, showing me things, telling me things. I want it to stop. I know, sweetheart. That's why we're here. To finish this, but if it goes back," her voice caught. "If I give it back, will I get sick again?" It was the question Abel had been dreading, the one he had no good answer for. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I do know that whatever healing you received, it's already in your body. The metal might have started it, but you're the one who's getting stronger. That's your strength, Emma, not the metals." Martha Hartley was crying quietly, her hand in her husband's. Bill looked at Abel with eyes that held both hope and desperation. "You'd better be right about this," he said, his voice rough. The townspeople gathered at the crater's edge as Abel descended into the excavation. The sphere sat in its carved-out hollow, humming its patient song, waiting. Up close, it was more beautiful and more unsettling than he remembered. The surface patterns seemed to move, flowing like water. and he could see his reflection distorted across its surface, or perhaps multiple reflections, multiple versions of himself existing simultaneously. Doc Pritchard and Tom Hutchins helped carry the crates down into the crater. As they approached the sphere with the first load, the fragments began to glow, the same soft blue light Abel had seen in his root cellar, but brighter now, pulsing in rhythm with the sphere's hum. "Here goes nothing," Hutchins muttered, and tipped the first crate. The fragments spilled out and seemed to hang suspended for a heartbeat before flying toward the sphere like iron to a magnet. But instead of clattering against the surface, they merged with it, flowing into the damaged section as if the metal was liquid rather than solid. The surface rippled and reformed, the gaps beginning to close. They brought more crates and more fragments merged with the sphere. Each integration made the humming grow louder, deeper, more resonant. Abel felt it in his chest, in his bones, a vibration that seemed to touch something fundamental in his being. The air itself felt charged, heavy with potential. Emma climbed down into the crater, her parents trying to hold her back but unable to prevent her. She walked toward the sphere with steady steps, her fragment held out before her like an offering. "Emma, wait." Abel started forward, but Cora caught his arm. "Let her," Cora said quietly. "This has to be her choice." The child stood before the sphere, so small against its bulk, and Abel saw her lips moving, though he could not hear the words. Then with sudden decisiveness, Emma pressed her fragment against the sphere's surface. It merged as the others had, flowing into the hole, and Emma staggered backward. Abel caught her before she fell, and the child wrapped her arms around his neck. "It's gone," she breathed. "It's out of my head. I can think clearly again." The sphere was nearly complete now, only a few gaps remaining in its surface. The humming had grown to a deep thrumming that Abel felt through his boots, through the earth itself. The patterns on the surface were moving faster, organizing themselves into what might have been symbols or diagrams or something beyond human comprehension. They poured the final fragments in, and the sphere sealed itself completely. For a moment, everything went silent. The humming stopped. The light faded. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the sphere began to change. The sphere rose, not with explosive force or dramatic display, but with a gentle, inexorable motion that defied gravity as casually as a leaf defies stone. It lifted from the crater floor, dirt and ice falling away, and hovered at chest height. The surface began to glow from within, not the blue pulse they had seen before, but a warm golden light that reminded Abel of sunset through amber. People stumbled backward, some in fear, others in awe. Abel held Emma close, his other hand instinctively reaching for Scout, who pressed against his leg and growled uncertainly. The sphere rotated slowly, the patterns on its surface flowing and reorganizing, and Abel had the distinct impression it was examining them, assessing the gathered townspeople with whatever served it as awareness. Then it spoke, not in words exactly, but in understanding that appeared fully formed in Abel's mind, and judging by the gasps around him, in everyone else's minds as well. Images and concepts flowed from the sphere, not human thoughts, but something that translated itself into terms they could grasp. It was a seed, a vessel designed to travel between stars, carrying within it the potential for life and growth. Its purpose was transformation, renewal, the mending of broken things and the nurturing of struggling things. The sphere had been one of thousands launched from a place Abel had no name for, sent out into the universe to find worlds that needed what it could offer. Earth had not been its intended destination. Some failure in its journey, a collision with debris, a miscalculation in trajectory, had brought it here, damaged and incomplete. The healing properties, the accelerated growth, the impossible plants blooming in winter, these were not side effects, but the sphere's fundamental nature, its reason for being. It existed to bring life where life struggled, to heal what was broken, but it needed to be whole, to fulfill that purpose completely. The fragmentation had limited it, scattered its power, and created the unfortunate side effect of influence over those who possessed the pieces. Now reunited, it could act as intended. Abel felt tears on his face and was not ashamed. The revelation was overwhelming, not just what the sphere was, but what it represented. Proof that life existed beyond Earth, that there were forces in the universe dedicated not to conquest or destruction, but to growth and healing. That somewhere out there, beings unknown had created this marvel and sent it forth as an act of generosity, spanning unimaginable distances. The sphere descended slowly until it rested on the crater floor again. The glow intensified, then spread outward in waves. Where the light touched, things changed. The churned earth softened and sprouted grass. Dormant seeds buried in frozen soil suddenly germinated, pushing through snow to reach sunlight. Trees that had been damaged by the impact straightened and healed, their broken branches mending before Abel's eyes. He felt it touch him, a warmth that spread through his chest and limbs, reaching old injuries and worn joints with gentle restoration. The ache in his knees that had plagued him for a decade faded. The stiffness in his hands from years of hard work eased. He was not made young again. The sphere was not offering reversal, but rather renewed, given back the full use of a body that age and labor had diminished. Around the crater, others were experiencing the same miracle. Doc Pritchard laughed suddenly, bending and straightening with an ease he had not known since his army days. Martha Hartley embraced her husband, both of them weeping. Emma stood straight and strong, her lungs clear, her body finally free of the consumption that had been killing her. Not through the compulsion of possession, but through genuine, complete healing. The light reached beyond the immediate area, spreading through the forest and toward town. Abel knew, without being told, that it would touch every living thing in Larkspur, every person suffering illness or injury, every plant struggling through winter, every animal weakened by the harsh season. The sphere was giving them a gift, a glimpse of what existence could be when life itself was nurtured and protected. But even as the healing spread, Abel understood something else. The sphere would not stay. It could not stay. Its nature was to seed and move on, to touch briefly and then continue its cosmic journey. Already he could feel it preparing to leave, gathering whatever energies it needed for the continuation of its mission. "Wait," he said aloud, though he knew the sphere did not hear in any conventional sense. Will you come back?" The answer came not in words, but in feeling. Perhaps, someday, if the need was great and the call was clear. But its purpose was to touch many worlds, not to remain in any one place. What it had given Larkspur was enough, not just healing, but knowledge. The knowledge that they were not alone in the universe, that miracles existed beyond human making, that life in all its forms was precious enough to be tended by forces beyond comprehension. The sphere rose again, higher this time, ascending toward the winter sky. As it climbed, it grew brighter, until looking at it was like looking at a small sun. Then, with a pulse of light that washed across the entire valley, it was gone, streaking back into the heavens from which it had fallen, continuing its journey to whatever destinations awaited. Spring came early to Larkspur that year. Or perhaps it simply felt that way after what they had witnessed. The snow melted faster than usual, and the valley floor burst into bloom weeks ahead of schedule. Fields that had been dormant showed remarkable growth, and livestock that had been struggling through winter suddenly thrived with renewed vigor. The healing the sphere had left behind persisted in ways both subtle and profound. Abel stood in his barn doorway as he had that night in January. But the world he looked out upon had changed. Or perhaps, he reflected, it was he who had changed. The watch in his pocket still ticked away the moments, still bore Margaret's inscription, but he carried it now not as a weight, but as a reminder that love endured, that the past informed but did not imprison, that life demanded engagement even when it brought uncertainty. Scout lay at his feet, grey-muzzled and content. The dog had been energized by the sphere's healing touch, moving with an ease he had not shown in years. Abel reached down and scratched behind the old dog's ears, grateful for this companion who had been with him through it all. The town itself had settled into a new rhythm. The initial excitement about the sphere had given way to something deeper, a shared experience that bound the community together in ways that went beyond proximity or commerce. They had stood at the edge of the unknown together and come through it changed, but intact. That counted for something. That counted for everything. Emma Hartley ran past his gate, chasing a butterfly, her laughter carrying across the spring air. She was 8 now, and healthy in a way that still brought tears to her parents' eyes. The sphere's healing had been complete, not just suppressing her illness, but eliminating it entirely, rewriting something fundamental in her body that allowed her to grow strong and whole. She waved at Abel as she passed, and he waved back, feeling a contentment he had not known in years. Doc Pritchard had documented everything, of course, writing detailed accounts of the sphere's properties and effects. He sent copies to universities and medical schools, though Abel suspected most recipients would dismiss the reports as fantasy or fraud. That was all right. The people of Larkspur knew the truth, and that was enough. Let the wider world think what it would. Tom Hutchins had surprised everyone by resigning as sheriff shortly after the sphere departed, saying he wanted to spend more time with his family and less time trying to keep order in a world that clearly operated by rules he did not understand. The new sheriff was younger, more flexible, more willing to accept that mysteries existed beyond legal jurisdiction. Jake Marston had left town entirely, unable to accept that the wealth he had imagined was gone forever. Abel did not miss him. Some men were too wedded to greed to ever find peace, and Marston had always been one of them. Better he sought his fortune elsewhere than poison Larkspur with his discontent. Footsteps on the path drew Abel's attention. Cora was walking toward him, a basket over her arm and a smile on her face. They had been spending more time together since the sphere's departure, and Abel had found himself looking forward to her visits with an anticipation that felt both familiar and new. "Brought you some bread," she said, settling beside him on the porch step. "And some of that jam you like." "You spoil me," Abel said, but he accepted the basket gratefully. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the valley wake to spring. Finally, Cora said, "Samuel Chen got a letter from the university in Missoula. They want to send researchers to study the impact site, see if there's any residual evidence of the sphere." "What did you tell them?" "Told them they're welcome to come, but they won't find much beyond changed soil and healthy plants." "The sphere didn't leave artifacts behind, just effects," Abel nodded. "That's probably for the best. Last thing we need is scientists turning Larkspur into a curiosity." "We're already a curiosity," Cora said with a slight smile. "The town that saw a miracle and lived to tell about it. But we'll manage." "We've managed everything else." She was right, of course. They had faced the unknown and survived it. More than survived, they had been transformed by it, individually and collectively. Not all change was easy, but some change was necessary. The sphere had taught them that. Margaret would have loved to see it, Abel said suddenly. "The sphere, I mean. She always believed in wonders." I was too practical to share her faith, but she was right. There are things beyond our understanding, and sometimes those things are miracles rather than threats. Cora reached over and took his hand, a gesture that had become familiar between them. "She'd be proud of you, Abel, of how you handled everything, how you kept the town together when it could have torn itself apart. I just did what needed doing. That's what leaders do. They see what needs doing and they do it, even when it's hard. Even when the choices aren't clear." Abel thought about that, about leadership and responsibility, about the burdens and blessings of being someone others turned to in crisis. He had not sought that role, but he had not shirked it either. Margaret had taught him that a man's character was revealed in adversity, and he hoped she would have been satisfied with what had been revealed in him. The sun climbed higher, warming the spring air. Scout dozed contentedly. In town, the church bells rang noon, calling people to their midday routines. Life continued in its essential patterns, made richer by the extraordinary, but not defined by it. Abel looked at Cora and saw in her eyes something he had thought closed to him after Margaret's death, the possibility of connection, of building something new while honoring what had been. It was not betrayal. It was not forgetting. It was simply living, which was what the sphere had taught them to do better. Stay for lunch. He asked. Cora smiled. I'd like that. They stood and went inside, Scout following at their heels, and as Abel closed the door behind them, he took one last look at the Spring Valley, at the town he had helped save, at the world the sphere had touched and healed, and left better than it found. Sometimes, he thought, the hardest choices were made not with guns, but with conscience. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate and very brave, those choices led not to regret but to grace. That was the final gift the sphere had given him, not just healing for his body, but permission to live fully in whatever time remained, to build rather than merely endure, to love rather than simply remember. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.